Good evening, everyone. We're about to get started. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Brian Amcott. I'm the Executive Director of the Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2019 Northeast Ohio Public Policy Series. Tonight's program, of course, addressing voting rights. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, who will introduce our panelists, I want to recognize and thank a few organizations who were instrumental in making this year's Public Policy Series possible. Our program partners are the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University, the League of Women Voters, Cleveland.com, Cuyahoga County Public Library, Cleveland Heights University Heights Public Library, and the Lakewood Public Library. We are grateful to our corporate sponsor, First Interstate Properties, for supporting this series. And I want to remind everyone about a couple of upcoming public policy sessions. February 26th at the Tincomville University Center on the campus of Case Western Reserve University will be a session on gun violence. And March 5th, also at the Tincomville University Center on the campus of Case Western Reserve University, will be a session focused on immigration. We really do ask for no formal outbreaks from the audience during the program, as it is geared towards hearing from our panelists. There is time set aside for Q&A at the end. Those of you who do have questions, there are note cards that either you have picked up on your way in, or if you don't have one, you can raise your hand and someone will bring you a note card. We ask you to put your questions down on the cards and then simply hold up the card, and someone will collect it and bring it up to our moderator, who will make the determination whether your question gets read for the panel this evening. So that's all of our formal public service announcements. It is with great pleasure that we welcome tonight Rich Exner from Cleveland.com, who will be our moderator for the session. He is currently data analysis editor for Cleveland.com and has written dozens of stories over the past several years about gerrymandering, elections, the census, and other aspects of governing. Before joining Cleveland.com in 2013, Rich was a reporter and an editor at The Plain Dealer and United Press International. He's a journalism graduate of Ohio State University. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rich Exner.
Thank you. We got a great panel here tonight, so let's not waste any time. Introduce each of them, give them a chance to introduce themselves to you before we get into some Q&A and see where our discussion takes us tonight. Camille Wimbush is the Elections Administration Director for Ohio Voice. She organizes statewide election protection efforts and coordinates the Ohio Fair Elections Network. The network is an advocate for modern election reforms and improved voter access. Other areas of her work has involved redistricting, fair courts, voter education. Here's something I like about her. Like me, we're both graduates of Ohio State. She got her law degree there. I played football out in the Oval outside the law building. I got my, but Camille, wide open tonight on this topic of voting rights. Introduce yourself to the crowd and tell them what's on your mind.
Thank you. As Rich mentioned, my name is Camille Wimbush. I'm the director of the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition. We're a network of nonpartisan voter advocates who are working to make sure our elections are modern and secure and accessible. I really feel like I have one of the best jobs in all of the state because I get to work to make sure our elections are running smoothly. I work to protect one of the most fundamental rights that we all have, which is voting. I get to make sure that we are expanding the franchise to include everyone, so particularly people of color, to make sure that they're included in the political process. And, you know, looking back at the elections, maybe 2 decades of elections, if we think back to 2004, I think we've made a lot of progress in our elections. I know I was standing in line for about 5 hours that day, and I'm sure many of you are also in long lines. And since then, we've made a lot of strides. We've got a very robust early voting period, 28 days of early voting. We have enjoyed, generous weekend and evening voting hours. We have online voter registration now, so people can update their registration and to register online easily. We've got a flexible range of ID, Election Day ID that people can use, whether it's a driver's license, a utility bill, a paycheck. So we've got options there for people. And we even allow it, people who are with criminal backgrounds, they're allowed to participate in our political process, whether it's, as soon as they've done their probation or parole, they can re-register. They can even register from jail if they're awaiting a sentence or serving time for a misdemeanor. So we've done a lot of really great things in Ohio. And I think it's just time for us to sort of build on those successes, to use the technology that we have at our disposal to be even better. And so I'm really excited tonight to hear from our esteemed panelists, as well as from you, for how we can dream to make our elections even better so that we can have more efficiencies, we can have more security, and we can really feel like we're removing any unnecessary barriers to people to have access to the ballot. So I'm looking forward to that.
Great. We're also lucky to have Ohio's newest Secretary of State here with us tonight, Frank LaRose. Like LeBron James and Steph Curry, he's a native of Akron. But neither of those basketball stars can boast this, is that he received a Bronze Star for his service for his country in Iraq, so quite diversified there. Just like Camille, he has a degree from Ohio State University, has been in consumer affairs. LaRose was first elected to the Ohio Senate in 2010, served in the state legislature until just now becoming the Secretary of State a few weeks ago. So we're delighted to have the newest Secretary of State with us tonight.
Thank you, Rich. And to my fellow panelists, I look forward to our conversations. And to all of you, thanks for coming out on a rainy rainy Thursday night in Northeast Ohio. It feels like spring, but we know that that the cold weather is coming back again. But the fact that all of you are willing to come out and participate in this conversation, and those that are watching from their computers or at home, I appreciate your interest in this. Those of us that work on elections issues are very passionate about it, and I'm glad that all of you are as well. My passion about elections, though, didn't start on the Senate floor. It didn't start during my time when I started running for Secretary of State. For me, it started on a battlefield. I got to see people risk their lives to vote in places like Iraq and in Kosovo. That's pretty profound when you see people risk their lives to do something that too many of our fellow Ohioans take for granted. This sort of ubiquitous exercise that happens a couple times a year has been run very well in Ohio, and the work of our elections workers is to be celebrated. Our elections officials throughout Ohio make it look easy, almost so much so that people have started to think that they can just take it for granted. And we all know that we can't take it for granted. Voting is a precious right that's been won and fought for, and I would say that voting rights are human rights. And I've been to places where people don't have that, and so for me, this is something that I take very seriously. I look forward to continuing to modernize and grow Ohio's system for voting. I was proud to sponsor the bill that created online voter registration in Ohio. I've proposed a variety of modernizations, such as Ohio paying the return postage for absentee ballots and putting absentee ballot requests online so that people can more easily request their absentee ballot. And so for me, I'm really excited about the next 4 years serving in this capacity. I won't rest until every Ohioan is participating in our elections, and that means I won't rest. My wife is acutely aware of that, but this is something I care a lot about, and so I look forward to partnering with all of you in this and finding ways that we can continue to excite people about participating in this most important civic process.
And our third panelist is Michael Lee, who is certainly an expert on the issues at hand tonight. He is senior counsel for the Brennan Center for Justice and Democracy program in New York City, where his work focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. Previously, Michael practiced law in Dallas and authored a blog covering redistricting and election issues that New York Times described as indispensable. 2 years ago, when the Ohio legislature was debating, beginning a public discussion finally about reforming gerrymandering, Mr. Lee came to Columbus and testified. And I always remember this, is that we think about gerrymandering as the people drawing the maps, trying to figure out where to put the Republicans and where to put Democrats. He pointed out during his testimony that if something's not done to clean up the process, it'll become so precise the next time around that it'll come down to like what Google searches are you doing, and other what cars did you buy, because of all the information that's now available to people at hands that want to do these things. And to me, it kind of took it to another level of why it's important to make a fair districting process, because of the level of detail that's available to map drawers these days.
So thank you, Rich, and thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you to all of you for coming out on this rainy night. So I work at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, and we're a think tank attached to the law school there. We also occasionally litigate cases, and we do a lot of advocacy in states pushing reforms on both voting and redistricting and a number of other areas. And when I go around the country now, I like to tell people that Ohio has become one of my poster children, right? You know, a state that has gotten a lot of things right. And that wasn't always the case. You know, Ohio was far from a poster child for a long time, especially in redistricting. But 2 times, Ohio voters now have, the Ohio legislature and then Ohio voters have passed really groundbreaking redistricting reforms, proving that something can be done on a bipartisan basis. The redistricting reform that passed last May not only passed the Ohio legislature almost unanimously, it carried every single congressional district in Ohio by at least a 2/3 margin, showing that Republicans and Democrats all can put aside their partisanship and understand that something is broken and that something needs to be fixed. And so Ohio is, you know, many people are very cynical around the country, and they think, you know, if the other party is in control and we can't do a ballot initiative or something, you know, we are sunk. And I always point to Ohio and say, like, there is a lot of energy. People get it. You know, lawmakers increasingly get it, but people certainly on the ground get it. That said, I will also put on my Asian parent hat a bit, right? And you know, you guys get like an A- for your reforms, and well, that seems really good. You know, from a as there's a saying, like an A- is like a Chinese C, right? And so, so, you know, now is a good time to talk about how you're going to like make some of the reforms that you guys passed work, because you've got the bones there, right? You've got the structure there. But there are a number of things that you could probably do, and it's time to be thinking about how you actually do that, both from the standpoint of putting in some more laws and some more meat on the bones, but also in engaging communities and you know, civic participation and getting that input. So a few things very quickly. One is the amendment that passed for the legislative redistricting is a little bit ambiguous about whether there could be public members or not. It'd be great to see some public members and not just lawmakers in addition to the statewide elected officials there. The amendment only requires a couple of hearings. It'd be great to have a lot more hearings around the state and pushing for more hearings so that people can come and participate, and pushing for those hearings to be broadcast on television and made available on the internet so people can see what the process is. It would be great if there was a clear and easy process for people to submit maps, and which means like making the data that's available so they can draw the maps and then giving them access to the software if they don't have it, and then you know, allowing them to draw maps for the whole state or for their community so they get to define what their communities are, either by themselves, sitting in a room, or better yet, getting together in tandem and saying like, hey, we've got to do this. And then having a commitment from the state that every map will be evaluated, right? In other words, every map will be run, like, is it fair from a partisan basis? Does it protect communities of color? Does it keep, you know, school districts or towns together? And everybody can, all of that should be publicly available so people can assess, and the people passing the maps can say, are these good or bad? So those are just a few of the things. So you guys have done really great, but there's a lot of hard work still ahead to make these reforms successful.
What I like about all those suggestions is I don't think any of them would require going back to the ballot. They're all things that, you know, you could take what's been approved and move forward with.
Yep.
So that kind of leads into the obvious, maybe simplest question of the night. What's the number one thing that can be done to get more people to vote more easily?
I think we could sit here all night and discuss that question. I think there's a number of things that we could do. Certainly policy reforms by making our registration process more efficient and more inclusive by adopting reforms like automatic voter registration, by adopting same-day registration. We see states that have same-day registration or election day registration have high participation rates because people who may have, forgotten about the deadline, or maybe they were purged, or just had an error in their registration, are able to correct that and have their ballot counted. I think there are things that we can do, like looking at transportation. If some folks have difficulties getting to their early vote center, are there ways that we can improve public transportation? Are there ways that we could have maybe multiple early voting centers in a county? There's several states, Indiana, Nevada, Georgia, they've got early voting centers at shopping malls and libraries, several throughout the county. So maybe that's something that we could explore. We can think about ways that we could offer more time for people to get out to vote. So if it's election day voting, corporations are doing things now where they're letting their employers have paid time off to vote. I saw today in the Cleveland Plain Dealer that the city of Sandusky has decided that election day is going to be an official holiday. So that way city employees have the day off so that they can vote. So I think there's a number of things that we can explore.
Yeah, I will just anecdotally say, like, having staffed election protection hotlines several cycles now, one of the biggest reasons why people who call in can't vote is simply that they moved and they didn't re-register in time for the deadline. In many cases, you have to have registered 30 days in advance, or some cases shorter. But if you've moved like 6 months ago and you just forgot to re-register, in many states you're out of luck. Because you can't vote in your old place, you can't vote in your new place, even if you could get to your old place. In many cases, you can't. And so something as simple as same-day registration or automatic voter registration, which would update your registration based on government records, which is a very secure way to do it, by the way. It's much more accurate than forcing you to fill out some paper form or even doing it online. Would be a big benefit. And, there's a huge difference between people who had that exact situation in a state like Wisconsin, which has same-day registration. They say, I moved and now I used to live in Madison, now I live in Milwaukee. Can I vote? And you say, yes, your state has same-day registration. Just here's your polling place. Go down there, bring some ID and register to vote. And, that would be a big thing in a highly mobile society. And where we're all busy with children and things like that, the idea that you're going to remember when you move in March that you have to register for November, just is something that so many people forget to do.
I would say three things that we can do to increase turnout. First is convenience, second is education, and third is competitive races. And so I'll start with convenience. My colleagues up here have named a couple of those things that we can do to make things more convenient for voters. A more automated system for voter registration and automating the update of addresses is one of them. Making it easier to request those absentee ballots is great. All of those are ways that we can make it convenient. Having convenient days and hours, all of those are important. The one thing I would caution, though, is that as we have seen over the last few decades, as we've made it more and more convenient, there's not a linear relationship between convenience and participation. So it's not as though with every convenience improvement, there's like a requisite increase in participation. So that we want it to be convenient, but that's not necessarily the thing. So what might be the thing? Well, I think education is part of it. When I talk to young people that don't vote, you encounter somebody who's in maybe their 20s and ask them why. And when you peel back the layer of the onions, you often get to this like fear of the unknown or trepidation about doing it wrong or looking foolish because you don't want to go in there the first time and like not do it right. And so I've had the idea of why don't we bring the voting machines out to the schools for when they do a student council election, when they vote on who's their, who's the or what's the class motto going to be, or what's the theme for the senior prom, or whatever else. Why not let them conduct that election on an actual voting machine that they're going to see in just a couple of years when they're registered to vote and voting, hopefully. Take some of the mystery out of it. It's easy to do. Those machines sit in storage at the Board of Elections otherwise. And I've talked to some of our elections officials, and that's something that would be easy enough to do. So education, taking some of the mystery out of it is part of it. Civics education is something that I think all of us should do as mentors. The fact that you're sitting in this room means that you're somebody that has a higher than average level of engagement and information, and so we all should be mentoring the young people in our lives, the kids down the street, the neighbor kids, the kids that we impact at our place of worship or school or what have you. And so education is a big thing. And then finally, competitive elections. My belief is that the single thing that increases turnout more than anything else is when there's a competitive election. I mean, let's celebrate something for a second. This election that we conducted last November was the highest turnout midterm election in Ohio's history. The highest turnout midterm election in Ohio's history was conducted just 2 months ago. We should be celebrating that. That's something we should be really proud of. But a competitive election is the thing that makes people want to engage and makes people want to come out and gets them more excited and that kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons why I've been such a long-time supporter of redistricting reform. Having those more competitive congressional districts is a good thing. It not only energizes voter participation, but it also makes those candidates get out there and compete and really work for it, and that's a good thing as well.
You brought up the redistricting reform. There's a case that's before the federal judge panel now in Cincinnati that wants to move up reform 2 years, so to speak, because what we voted on last May doesn't take effect until the maps are drawn after the next census in 2021 or so. They're announced the dispute, the League of Women Voters and others filed a lawsuit to try to reform it beginning with next year's election. Yeah. In one of the recent court filings, the statement was made that you need to know the map by, I want to say, mid-September, and that kind of pushes the timetable on this. Is that a hard and fast rule in mid-September? How late can you take a map if it takes a while to get this lawsuit resolved? We have 2 other gerrymandering cases pending before the U.S. Supreme Court, so I'm not so sure how fast things could move if a court determined Ohio needed a new map.
Yeah, I'll first start by saying that at midnight on January 14th, I effectively became a party in this lawsuit when I became the Ohio Secretary of State. So my team would probably caution me to be just a little bit cautious on what I say on this. But I would say that the techniques and process for drawing maps has gotten faster because of modern GIS technology and the computers that do it. But I'd also say that I think that mid-decennial redistricting is kind of a dangerous thing to start doing. I think that having a predictable sort of stately process every 10 years where we draw new district lines is the best case scenario to avoid confusion of voters and that kind of thing. And we have finally, with the support of over 75% of Ohioans, for the first time ever, we're going to have a required bipartisan process that when we are able to run that process through in 2021 and create new lines, hopefully with bipartisan consensus in the Redistricting Commission, we'll have a much better outcome for the people of Ohio. That's when we should draw the district maps, is in 2021 and not as a result of a court order in 2019.
Even if you had a problem with the way it was done in the past and thinks this is a better way to go forward?
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, listen, the past process was flawed, and flawed processes result in flawed maps. But it was the process in place, and it's been challenged and upheld already once. And this idea that we sort of run to the courthouse steps and get a judge's order to draw new lines is not the best thing for the sort of health of our democracy. I think that the predictable every 10-year process of drawing new district lines is what we want to see. Now, we have a history on this in Ohio. If you go back to the 1860s and 70s, the General Assembly at the time realized that the Ohio Constitution didn't set a timeline for drawing new district lines, and so there was this period of time where there was this like whipsaw retribution between the Whigs and one of the other parties that is no longer in existence. And every time the balance of power changed in the General Assembly, they drew new district lines. And so for like a period of 30 years, there were something like 15 different sets of district lines, and to the point where nobody knew which district they lived in or who their member of Congress was or whatever else. So we don't want to. Mid-decennial redistricting is a generally bad idea, I think.
So I could say something a little bit about the court timing. So there is a request that's currently before the court in Cincinnati to delay the case until after the Supreme Court hears the North Carolina and Maryland partisan gerrymandering cases, which the court will do at the end of March, and it'll issue decisions most likely at the end of June. And so there's a request that, the Ohio case should just wait for that to be resolved. Of course, then that runs into the issue of timing, right? And so there's opposition to that because the goal is to have new maps in place so that you can seamlessly run elections in 2020. It's unclear what the court in Cincinnati will do. The last pleading was just filed today, I believe, probably on your behalf. And so I haven't read it yet, so I don't know what what position you took. But we'll see what the court does. If the court does decide to delay the case until after the North Carolina and the Maryland cases, it doesn't mean that there won't be a new map for Ohio. It might mean that there's no new map for Ohio because of the September timing, but it might mean that the court ends up if it feels like the violation in Ohio's map and is bad enough, it may decide that it's more important to have the court decides is a fair map in place and simply do things like delay the primary or adjust other things to allow the new map to come into effect later than September. So we don't know what will happen, and that very scenario has happened a lot in my old home state of Texas, where we've had sort of special primaries and really weird times and things like that. So that would be up to the court, and we'll see how that all plays out.
I would also point out that elections held at times other than the times people are accustomed to tend to be low turnout affairs, and that's just another sort of problematic function of that.
It resulted in Senator Ted Cruz in Texas because David Dewhurst got 48.9% of the vote, and Ted Cruz got 27%, but Ted Cruz won the runoff and ended up in the Senate. So. Because of a delayed primary, because of redistricting fights. So
regardless of whether early voting increases turnout, I think at a minimum we'd probably agree for some people it's a convenience or they wouldn't be doing it. Yeah. And I, for instance, usually early vote downtown because I'm a few blocks from the Board of Elections. And what I found convenient about it is I can go to a place and tell them where I live, and they look it up and they give me a ballot. We're still doing, but if you go on election day, you have to go to one particular place. It only works ahead of time. Some of these other things just seem like they've just gotten outdated because they've never been changed over the years. But on early voting, right now in Ohio, and correct me if I'm wrong, you get a notice, and then you turn it in, and then they send you the ballot. In other states, the ballots automatically go out. And then also in early voting in Ohio, the hours are the same. Every county is treated the same, and we're getting into a debate about whether every county is the same or not, but they're the same. There's just one voting place in each county as opposed to maybe multiple where travel time might be more. What would need law changes to improve this, and what can be done without law changes to make early voting more convenient even if it's not going to raise the total votes?
I'll start with a couple things that I've proposed and would like to see done. You talked about the ballots, the absentee ballot request. So the Ohio Secretary of State for the last several cycles has mailed out a postcard type form that goes out for the general election in the even-numbered years that allows people to request their absentee ballot. You can also print off your own absentee ballot request form and mail it in. You can go to the library or the BMV or a number of different places and pick up an absentee ballot request form. That process should be put online. Just as I always say, ask any of your friends that are in their 20s how many have stamps on them or know where they have stamps or whatever else. It's just, and I'm not making a joke. It's just not common for a lot of people. Or what is a stamp? And what you will find is that that a lot of people, that's just not a daily part of their life, mailing things with a postage stamp on it. And so we should be able to request our absentee ballot online. I've been proposing that for a long time, and now that I'm the Secretary of State, I'm going to keep on pushing for that.
That's something you can't do. You need the legislature to.
I need the legislature to do that. I believe. I mean, we could. Suppose we could try, but no, I think that would need to be enacted by the General Assembly, and again, that's also the right way to do it, to get that kind of buy-in and that kind of thing from the legislature. But that's one thing that we need to do. The idea of more than one voting location for early voting in a county is something that I'm very much open to. This is something that has been a point of conflict in the past, and county boards of elections tend to tie vote on where do they put these early voting centers and that kind of thing. But we should be able to be big boys and girls about this and come to an agreement where we can have a convenient set of maybe 1 or 2 or 3 voting locations in a county. The idea of vote by mail, certain Western states vote exclusively by mail. I think that we like in Ohio that it's a choice. You can go to a voting location if you want on election day and be greeted by one of your neighbors and cast a ballot. And it's kind of a civic, public event for some people to come out to the polls, and that's a good thing. That's a neat thing. And I love when I'm out there at the polls on election day, seeing how many people bring their children with them. And that's just a simple exercise. Mom and dad bring their kids to the polls, but that's one thing that's great about it. But as far as automatically sending out the absentee ballots, the idea that I've had is to make it a function of when you cast your ballot, it says, would you like one? When you cast your May ballot, would you like one in November? And then you sort of each time have that sort of ongoing ability to just request one for the next election. And the reason why that's probably a better idea than just sort of automatically sending out ballots is that if someone moves and a ballot is sent to their old address and there's no sort of accountability of that person would not be able to cast a live ballot on election day. They would have to cast a provisional ballot under Ohio law, because at that point there'd be like 2 ballots out there in that person's name, right? And so mailing them out without a sort of request along with it, or without the accountability of knowing that it's actually going to the person that wants it and that kind of thing, can be shaky. So that's one of those areas where we just need to be careful about what we're doing.
Anything else from either of you?
I would just add, I think it's great that we do have uniform hours now. I think it's helpful to tell people that when the polls are actually going to be open for early voting. I think that as we look, the settlement agreement that we have in place that governs early voting, in the last several years, we've gotten used to voting on the weekends, during the evenings. It's going to be expired, so that doesn't cover us for the next election. So that's something we need to work towards to get in place for future elections. And I think that we just need to have more education and more promotion so that people get used to and hear about when there are early voting opportunities available to them.
There are an awful lot of questions here, just by the way, about 6 or 8 of them about why not vote by mail. So at least amongst this group, that's a big topic
I will say,
here.
vote by mail is great, especially if you can request the ballots online. My mother lives in Minnesota, and she can request it online, and then she gets to look on the website, and it tells her, we've got your request, the ballot has been mailed, you've returned the ballot, we've verified your signature, and it just goes step by step online, and you're able to do that, and that can be great. I will caution that, just all vote by mail is something that is not particularly popular, especially among people of color. There are a lot of older people of color who will tell you that they want to go see the ballot go in the box. They want to feed it through the reader, and they want to hear the beeps, and they don't trust it. And so you want to be respectful of the fact that people come at this through different kind of lenses, right? And the states that have adopted all vote by mail tend to be like Washington and Oregon, right? And they're states that are very white and don't have a lot of sort of communities of color, at least historically not. And so it may be a little bit easier there. They're also a little bit techie and do things like that. So.
There's been a lot said, and spinning off 2 or 3 different questions here, but on the same topic. There's been a lot said in recent years about voter fraud. At least that I know of in Ohio, when your predecessor, John Husted, looked at it, it was maybe numbers in the 10s or 15s that maybe voted they shouldn't. I see it's been controversial in Texas recently where numbers came out close to 100,000. It keeps shrinking. Is there an issue?
100,000 supposed
right.
non-citizens who are registered, many of whom, and they were non-citizens when they got their driver's license. Many people subsequently became citizens, right? And so
it's just down to a handful, best I can tell from accounts. So I guess, are there fraud issues that need to be addressed, and does the public need to know that if there aren't fraud issues, that some of this is hogwash? Is that best we can tell is that the elections are fair and equitable?
So this is something that I was very candid about on the campaign trail and since then. And I think that as elections officials, as voting rights experts and advocates and journalists and informed members of the public, that we need to have a very thoughtful, candid conversation about this issue. It worries me immensely that there is this tendency to overstate voter fraud, particularly on the right, and say that there's this widespread systemic voter fraud. It's not true. There's not widespread systemic voter fraud. But I think that it's equally concerning and damaging when there are politicians on the right claiming voter fraud, that at the same time you hear politicians on the left sometimes claiming systemic and widespread voter suppression. And what I'm very clear to say is that reasonable people should be able to agree that neither of those are ever acceptable. We cannot accept voter fraud. We cannot accept voter suppression. And I think that as like Ohioans, as Americans, we should be able to say, yes, we agree that we can't accept either one of those. And we can put thoughtful things in place to prevent fraud and to prevent suppression. But to say that it is systemic and widespread and sort of occurring behind every corner, only, first of all, the reason that people do that, politicians do that, is because it's an emotional issue. Elections, voting rights, like hit us all right here. And that's good that we're passionate about this. And so people get fired up about those things. And it results in people writing checks and coming to rallies and doing things that politicians want them to do. And so they push that hyperbole button and try to get people ginned up about those things. But the corrosive result of that, of overstating problems with our elections. Now, we should call them out when we see them, but when you overstate problems, it corrodes the trust that people have in our form of government. And it makes the average Ohioan say, fraud over here, suppression over there, it's all a raggedy mess, and I don't want anything to do with it. And that's the worst case scenario. We want Ohioans to know that when they cast their ballot, whether it's 28 days of early voting, vote by mail, vote in person, that their vote will count and be accurately counted, and that when they turn on their television station of choice on election night or listen to the radio or whatever else, those results scrolling across the bottom of the screen will include theirs. And that's how we pick leaders, and every vote matters. So this is why I'm sorry that it took a long time to explain this, but this is why I worry about this sort of drumbeat of claiming constantly that there are these problems systemically occurring in our elections when I just haven't seen any evidence to believe that that's true.
I'm getting a lot of comments and then some questions, so in the matter of speed, I'll try to answer a couple of them. Correct me if I'm wrong, and then we'll move to the next question. Somebody wants to know what the cutoff age is, or date is for youth to vote, and it's my understanding you have to be 18 on Election Day, except if it's if you're voting in a primary and you're 17 and you'll be 18 by the general election, you can vote in the primary. Is that correct?
Correct.
That's correct. But it would be great if we could move towards pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds like a lot of states have done. That way you get people who are already in the pipeline. Like you said, get the voting machines out to people, get them registered, and then when they turn 18, press the button.
Something else that's great for young folks is a program called Youth at the Booth, where you can take 17-year-old high school students and have them work the polls for Election Day. And what a great education that is for them. And also you talked about making Election Day a holiday so people could vote, but also so they could work the polls, because we need, I bet many of you are election workers, right? We need more people to come out and work the polls on Election Day. Some companies are starting to do what they call a day for democracy, where they give people a paid day off to go work the polls, which is a great thing. 17-year-old voting, I use this as like a hook for high school students when I speak to them. I say, you know, you can brag years from now that you voted when you were 17, because that's kind of a rare distinction. And so in Ohio, if you're going to be 18 by Election Day, you can vote in the primary. Now, you can't vote issues, interestingly. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. You're voting in the primary to sort of narrow down your choices for the general, but as a 17-year-old, you can't vote on tax levies or liquor options or, you know, whatever else, for example. You can't. And so, yeah, so that's a cool thing in Ohio, that 17-year-olds can vote in the primary.
Another person wants to know if they mail in their ballots, does it get counted after all the others? And my understanding is if the ballot got to the Board of Elections in time, it gets counted the same day. But what gets added later are those ballots that were postmarked in time didn't arrive at the Board of Elections until after Election Day, or from overseas, or provisionals.
The
Is that
vast
right?
majority of absentee ballots get counted first, actually. And this is one of those like Mythbuster kind of things that I want to do. That there's all these myths out there that people say, well, if you register to vote, you're going to get called for jury duty. False. It's not true. In fact, jury pools can be drawn in a lot of different ways, not just from voter registration rules. But there, people say, well, if you vote by mail, they only count your ballot if it's too close to call. False. When you see results already at 7:45 on election night, those are the absentee. There's some head shaking because a lot of y'all work the elections. Those are the absentee ballots because they run those right at 7:30. In many cases, they've already run and they tabulate them right at 7:30. And so the first votes that are counted, if you want to be the first one counted, vote by mail.
Then I got a question about what do you think of ranked choice on voting? I guess this goes to the competitive thing. I don't know exactly what ranked choice means. Let me know if it's similar. I know in California it's top two. Are we talking about the same thing?
No,
when
I
you say
think
ranked
what they're
choice?
talking about is
The
you
main
would,
system.
yeah, you would just sort of, if there were three you could say, I want to vote for Jill Stein, but if she doesn't win, then you reallocate
Oh,
the
okay,
vote.
so that's
Yeah,
ranking. Is that different than California? Do you only
Yeah.
vote for one person in California?
So, well, California has what some people call a jungle primary, where the two candidates that receive the most, it's called that because it's the law of the jungle kind of thing, made the strongest survive kind of deal. So the top two candidates, regardless of party, advance to the general. So in theory, your general election, in practice, not in theory, can be two Democrats, or a Republican and a Democrat, or a Democrat and a Green Party candidate, or what have you. What they do in Maine and I think a few other states with this ranked choice thing, which it's interesting. This, like, to me, is this like fun sort of poli-sci debate, but I don't know if we're ready to do something like this in Ohio because it's not fully like we're Midwesterners. We like to do things cautiously here, you know. But you have to get 50% of the vote, and it can be a field of a bunch, so that you say my first choice is Bob Buckeye, and then it's Susie Buckeye as my second choice, and then it's Joe Blow as my third choice. Sure. And if any one of those candidates don't get 50%, then they retabulate them with the second choice, and it goes like that. It's
until you get a winner.
Until you get a winner. Maine does it this way. It's.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Maine.
The argument is that it encourages people to vote for third parties and it doesn't force people to just support the two main parties. On the other hand, there is the argument that it doesn't really help with the issue that many people see pressing, which is polarization, right? The idea that we have many more niche parties, both on the left and the right, doesn't necessarily help with eliminate polarization, although it can be an effective way to, especially if you have to have runoffs, right, and avoiding having to have a low turnout runoff, it can be effective, whether that runoff is in the primary, as it is in many states, or in the general election.
So as opposed to in California, Republicans and Democrats are in the same primary, and the top two vote getters go to the general. So I think in several congressional districts this past year, you had a Democrat versus a Democrat in the general election.
Yeah, and part of the appeal of that is that in these gerrymandered districts where it's sort of always going to be a person of this party or it's always going to be a person of that party, it at least gives candidates a choice between two, and that it can dissuade some of the sort of extremism that you see, where if you appeal to the far right, you can win a primary. If you appeal to the far left, you can win a primary, and then you just skate to a general with no real competition. And that's kind of the idea behind that, but it in practice doesn't always turn out that way. So,
how about the weakest link in our current voting system?
I think that question was directed toward Camille.
No?
And for some reason, I ended up with a box of tissues here, so I can move them over here if that's like a...
Well, how about, since we don't have any takers on that one, there's been a lot of talk in the last year about purging the voters in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, there's been an argument, well, we need to have a clean voting roll, which I don't really understand, short of an argument that somebody voted it in their address when they went to school at Bowling Green and voted again in Pittsburgh, where they're living now. And I don't know if there's evidence of that happening. But if it is the belief that it has to be pared down, why not expand provisional votes to people who might have been taken off the roll, so they can, if they were taken off, I guess the fear is that you're taking off the voting registration list and you didn't know and you showed up to vote and you can't vote, you can't even vote provisionally. So should it be one or the other?
So I think the purging is certainly has been problematic. Certainly there are purges that we do. If someone is moved and we have evidence that they've moved, then the rules should be updated to reflect that. But certainly there's been a lot of contention over whether people who don't vote frequently enough should have their voting right seen as a use it or lose it proposition. And if the purges, certainly the Supreme Court has weighed in and said that it's legal and it's constitutional, but if we do go forward with the purging, I think there are ways to improve it, certainly by having the AVR, which we already talked about, having people who are already interacting with government agencies, having that opportunity to have their registration updated when they're already giving their information to sign up for benefits or sign up for disability services. We can also look at expanding. We have a new rule that says, if you visit the BMV and you've updated your driver's license information and that matches what's already on the voter registration rolls, that should serve as a confirmation and make it so that you're not eligible to be purged. That's a great thing. We want to expand that to include other agencies, like we said, for Job and Family Services. People are signing up for benefits. Same information is already being given out. If that's a confirmation, that should count, and so that person should not be purged. And then if we had Election Day registration, so that if someone were accidentally purged, there is an avenue for someone to be able to vote and register and get their ballot counted, because we have people who are wanting to participate, and we should be encouraging that.
Well said. This is an issue that I've given a lot of thought to, and what I'd like to see us do is modernize this process. Just because the current process in Ohio has been in place for 30 years, and just because it's been carried out by both Republican and Democratic secretaries of state, because it's been upheld by the Supreme Court, none of that makes it ideal. And so what the current process relies on is this sort of antiquated assumption that if you go 6 years and we don't hear from you, and then you don't respond to the postcard that's sent to your house, and in most cases repeatedly, I think we're up to like 3 mailings that have gone out to try to get attention from folks. The assumption is that that person has died or moved out of state or moved out of the jurisdiction. That was maybe the best they could do 30 years ago when they put that in place. And by the way, maintaining accurate voter rolls is the responsibility of the Ohio Secretary of State and the county boards of elections, not only in state law, but in the Federal Voting Rights Act. And so this is something that we have to maintain accurate lists to the extent we can, but we can do better than what we have right now. What I would like to see is that more automated process where when people interact with state government, that's an opportunity to update their address. When somebody gets a fishing license or pays their taxes or receives benefits from the Department of Jobs and Family Services, those are all opportunities to updating their driver's license. All of those are opportunities
How's
to
that different
automatically.
from now? Is it just at BMV right now?
Yeah, it's just at BMV right now, and sort of part of this is breaking down the silos in state government. A lot of Ohioans assume, well, I updated my address with the tax department and your government and their government, so you must all talk to each other, right? Well, no, it doesn't work. As you all know, there are these silos, unfortunately, and the Department of Taxation guards their data and doesn't share it with the other parts of the state government, that kind of thing. And so any of those interactions with state government should create that opportunity to update the voters' information or register them to vote in a more automated process. But also, we can make better use of National Change of Address database, systems like ERIC, which was created as a partnership with a bunch of states. It's sort of inspired by the Pew Charitable Foundations, and now there's 26 states that are part of it. My good friend, the Michigan Secretary of State, newly elected Secretary of State in Michigan, she just signed up to be a part of ERIC, and it's a data sharing protocol, pretty wonky stuff, but it allows if somebody moves to one of the other states that's part of ERIC, then we can be notified and then cancel their registration here because they've moved to a new state. And so when you talk about this in terms of sort of database management, it's not nearly as exciting as some of the kind of political slogans that have been around this. But it's a process that we need to take seriously. We need to balance this imperative of maintaining accurate lists but not inconveniencing Ohioans that are infrequent voters.
So from what I found on the Brennan Center's website, and I think elsewhere too, is at least 15 states are doing this automatic registration now.
Yep.
Michigan's doing it. West Virginia's doing it. Is Ohio going to, or are we just going to say it's a good idea?
Ohio
so.
should do it.
I hope so.
Yeah. It really is much more secure and logical, and if you're concerned about like false registrations or something like that, just being automatically registered, it's just it's cheaper, it's more secure, it's better.
And by the way, includes an opt-out for those who, for religious reasons or whatever else, believe in not participating. There's an opportunity. It's like that old song, "If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice." I guess a little Rush reference, but anyway, there are people that for their own reasons choose not to be a registered voter. I don't know why, but they do, and so that would be an option under something I would propose if we would have an automated system. It'd be an opt-out.
I mean, is there talk amongst your former colleagues in the State House, or is that
Yeah. I mean, again, it took me 4 years to get online voter registration done, and I hope this process doesn't take quite as long. But I'm in this for the long haul.
What's the opposition like when you wanted online voter registration? Why do people say no?
Just hesitancy to change, more often than not. I think that there's a little bit of technophobia among some as it relates to elections, and just sort of, we know the way it works right now, let's not mess with it because it introduces opportunities for mischief or whatever else. There's that fear. And so we have to educate our colleagues in the legislature about how the process works. And we did that with online voter registration, and we got broad bipartisan support for it in the final analysis. But
it seems like what else you're talking about here kind of leaps over the hurdle I didn't realize existed until like my kids turned 18 and wanted to vote, but they were the one of, seems like many people now aren't getting their driver's licenses until later. Therefore, they didn't have the driver's license to use to move their address, to request their ballots and so forth. And
state ID works as well. But yeah, if you don't have any form of state ID, then you have to still use the paper method. That's true.
Were you starting to say something? Discussion earlier about getting more people interested in voting, and maybe it ties to competitive elections. I've gotten 2 or 3 questions here about campaign finance reform. That's a little bit off of voting, but yet, does that play into getting people interested in voting? Is campaign finance, the laws the way they are now, discouraging people from voting, and can it change?
I think that it could. I mean, if people are willing to think about sort of innovative reform. So, like in New York, there's small dollar public matching of donations up to $250 now. It's matched 8-to-1. So if I give $100, that becomes $900 with the matching, right? It's 100 of mine and 800 from the city of New York, and so that encourages elected officials to go campaign not among big donors and not have these fancy fundraisers at law firms and country clubs and places like that, but to go into the community and say, hey, give me $10 because that'll be $100 for me, right? Or, and so on and so forth. And it's really not that expensive for the government to do. It's not cheap, but it's also not, compared to all of the things that government spends money on, really that big a spend. And that can be a really powerful incentive for elected officials to engage people in their own communities. I've always thought like maybe you have a higher match if it's from somebody in your district, right? So you're actually talking to somebody in your district and you're saying, will you vote for me and will you give me $25, right? I mean, then you're actually sort of doing something and engaging people. And like, people don't just matter because they're voters, they matter because they're potential sources of money, even at small dollar amounts. So I think that is one campaign finance reform that can be very effective. And in New York City, almost all of the city council electeds now just use small dollar donations to run their campaigns, even at very high level offices like mayor. And so it has totally transformed sort of the dialogue.
I believe that campaign finance can have a big impact on polarization. And if you think polarization is a problem, and I personally really do, I think that I've kind of explored this, that the the way that district lines are drawn, the sort of gerrymandering issue, the way that we finance campaigns, the kind of segregation that we do, this idea that you can sort of tell a lot about someone's political leanings based on their zip code, and sort of who we surround ourselves with, and you can surround yourself with media of all kinds that just sort of props up your current view and never challenges that. So, you know, all of those are the things that I think are contributing a lot to polarization. I think that the issue with the way that campaigns are funded is that in many cases, the donations come from these single issue groups, and you will never be pro this enough or anti that enough for these groups, and people, I've seen this with my colleagues, will sort of try to appease these groups to get their support, and it pushes people to these extreme positions that are really not mainstream. And so, you know, that's one of the things. That's kind of the super PAC issue or what have you. But also transparency is just I think one of the most important things with campaign finance. Limits are one thing, and limits, it's kind of like you push your hole in the hole in the dike, and then it pops out somewhere else. And there's this thing with campaign limits that tend to be sort of arbitrary, where money finds its way, and people that have resources find their ways to support candidates. But I think that the most important and most impactful thing that we can do is to have full transparency. I've proposed repeatedly, and I introduced this bill 3 years in a row now, and I'm going to now push it as the Secretary of State to bring transparency finally to local campaign finance. We in Ohio who run for state offices, whether it's Secretary of State or governor or state rep or senator, we file our reports online. You upload a CSV file to the Secretary of State's website, and poof, it's there for journalists that do good data analysis work like you do, Rich, to view it. You can sort it. We've talked about this. You can sort it by columns. You could sort of sort my campaign finance report and find out how many people in this zip code give me how much and all of that. That's good news. I mean, that's what we should have. With local campaign finance, it doesn't work that way. In law, it's still required that, and we just had a filing last week, that people running for local office, mayor, city council, judge, county commissioner, and in big counties, these can be multi-million-dollar campaigns for mayor, county commissioner, county executive, that kind of thing. You're still required to submit like stacks of dead tree format paper financial reports at the Board of Elections. And the best the Board of Elections can do is maybe turn that into a PDF, which is essentially just a photograph of that piece of paper, right? And then load those up on your website. So, and that's in very few counties. In most counties, you have to go to the counter to get the document, and they print it out in paper. But if you can download the PDF, then at least you can see it. But if it's a 400-page long PDF, that's not sortable, that's not searchable, that's a pain in the neck for you. And so that all should be put online. I'm trying like heck to get that done, and it's time that we modernize that process for local campaign finance.
It drives me crazy. The forms have obviously been filled out on a computer. So it's taking something that's in a database of some sort, put it onto a piece of paper so that then you can't do anything with it. If it's in a database, you can search it and look around.
They've analogized it or something, yeah.
I see this being called like the Rich Exner law. Right?
Then I'll lose the advantage of having the tricks to get around it, right?
Yeah.
Somebody asked, voting for all people is a right not available for those in jail awaiting sentencing unless done in a community group. I'm not sure. I thought that the only people in Ohio that were prevented from voting were felons that were sentenced and serving their time. Is that right?
Correct.
But maybe there's issues here. If there are issues that need to be addressed on those that are legally allowed to vote in Ohio getting, in that process, if they're in jail or whatever, waiting?
I know it certainly is not a very well-known fact. A lot of the myth out there is that if you have a criminal background, you can't vote. And I know there's probably lots of jails who, this is not, unless there's a community group that's going in there and saying proactively, like, here's your absentee ballot, here's how you can request one, here's how you can get one. It's just not, it's not being done on a scale that we need.
Yeah, this year, or last year in the election, and this was news to me, and I guess there's a lawsuit pending on this, but it was found that, for like the person who was taken into jail like that day on election day, You know, is there a process to let, because they've not been convicted of anything, right? And they're sort of in custody awaiting trial kind of thing. And so there's a lawsuit about this. It's kind of an interesting concept.
I guess
like,
they couldn't ask for an absentee ballot if they're taking it on election day.
Yeah, currently, I suppose that we don't have I mean, like, nobody thought of that, right? Like, sometimes the law is a human process that humans work on, and so, like, nobody thought of that. So maybe there's something there that can be improved. No.
Along the lines of jails, I found it fascinating last year when we were doing some gerrymandering work to see to what extent prisons played to help draw the lines to get the right number of people in each district. And so more than once, 4 or 5 times, I think, in Ohio, the congressional district lines went right around the prison where you could pick up a couple thousand people to be represented from a congressperson, and those people weren't his voters anyway. And what I learned is in other states, I think they call it prison gerrymandering, has become an issue that you take, and it's more so, Ohio's more spread out with, but it happens to some extent with multiple urban areas. But say in Illinois, where the urban area has most of the people and the prisons are down south, it's a shifting of the legislature.
That's especially the case at the legislative and the local level. It's a little bit less impactful at the congressional level, but it certainly does have its impact. And this year, the Census Bureau has said that they will, if states want to, help adjust the data and put people back to where they want. You know, there was a push to have the Census Bureau do this automatically. But they decided not to do that, but they will cooperate with states that voluntarily want to do this. So like California and New York and a number of states reallocate people to where people lived before they were incarcerated, with the in part because of the recognition that they will ultimately probably go back there, right? Nobody who's from New York City is imprisoned in upstate New York decides, like, you know, I kind of like it up here, I'm going to stay. So like they should be counted in New York City. So.
Yeah, so he said about it, counting the people where they lived when they were incarcerated as opposed to counting where they happen to be in prison and can't be voting anyway. I mean, any other opinions on that? Or
no, I mean, it's just one of the things about the way that redistricting has been done in the past that's, you know, a little insidious. But let's also remember that redistricting happens at the local level as well. We draw district lines for county council races. We draw district lines for city council races, and there's all these different local processes for doing that, and many of those need to be reformed as well.
And we have the technology now to actually like reallocate people much more easily in most states, right? You know, prisons actually they're not in the business of knowing where you used to live. I mean, that's not something you need to know on a daily basis to run a prison. And so they have the information in a database. They just need to be able to query it easily, because the way that it works in the prison is that you don't fill out a census form. The prison fills it out for you so that they can do it. They can just supply the spreadsheet if they can query it. It used to be that they would have to type up long lists and stuff like that, so it was impossible. But now, with the advent of technology, it should be easy to readjust people to where they are. Again, if states want to do it, the Census Bureau will fully cooperate with states in doing that.
We got a question here about, is there concerns about cybersecurity, potential foreign or other interference with the voting process?
Sure, there are concerns, and rightfully so. My staff has heard me say over and over again that the bad guys, and this is a saying from back when I was in the Army, that the bad guys only have to be right once, but we have to be right every day. And that was driven home to me at the beginning of this week, when this is how I got to start my week, with a classified briefing out at the Department of Homeland Security with experts from FBI and DOJ and others. And obviously I can't go into the nitty-gritties of that, but what the takeaway was is that foreign actors and criminal groups and all kinds of other folks want to play games that will cause people to have less confidence in their elections. There's no reason to believe, there's no evidence that shows that there's been anything that has impacted the tabulation or the counting of votes. But you know, these popular myths sort of evolve, and one person says something to another, and I read it on Facebook, so it must be true, and et cetera, et cetera. And what the bad guys, I use that term generically, of course, but what the bad actors want to do is things like knock a BOE website offline and replace it with some, you know, anarchist slogan or something, and that doesn't change the way that votes are counted. It may inconvenience people that need to use that website to download a form or something for a period of time. But what it does is it erodes the confidence. It makes people think, well, if they can do that, maybe they can mess with it. What we need to do also is educate people about the real safeguards that are in place. I visit a lot of boards of elections. I was at the Lake County Board of Election today. I've been to over 60 county boards of elections. And I think that we ought to work on bringing journalists in to learn the process and understand the process so that when they do their reporting, that they get it right. The machines that tabulate the votes are never connected to the internet. There's what they call an air gap. The machines that count the votes and tabulate the votes are the only thing they're ever plugged into is the wall outlet that powers them. And so, for any of those machines to be tampered with, somebody would have to physically put hands on them, and those rooms are secured with 2 locks, one that's controlled by the Democrats at the Board of Elections and one that's controlled by the Republicans at the Board of Elections. Many of you know all this. And so, there are a lot of good safeguards in place. We've got to do more to protect our infrastructure. I'm going to be proposing a piece of legislation that can help us move in that direction, where we're going to put a chief information security officer in my office that will not only serve the Secretary of State's office, but the county BOEs as well. We need to make it the law of Ohio that we do post-election audits. I'd like to see us eventually move those to a sophisticated process called a risk-limiting audit. If you ever want to geek out about risk-limiting audits, Google it. It's a pretty interesting statistical technique for sort of the most accurate audit, or most efficient and accurate audit. But also things like believe it or not, the Ohio National Guard has a great cyber security capability. Leading the way in many cases, the city of Akron found this out, unfortunately, just recently when they were the victims of a attack, and the Ohio National Guard was able to deploy some of these really high-tech experts to help Akron recover. I think that we can expand that. I think that I've got a proposal for a thing called the Ohio Cyber Reserve. We all kind of understand that historically when there's a flood, the people that fill the sandbags, or when there's a riot, the people that come out to help with that would be the National Guard. Well, the modern threat that's evolving is a cyber threat, and to have these highly trained professional forces sort of available, to ring the bell when we need them, and to be deployed around the state to assist local government, county boards of elections. It would be a first in the nation concept to create the Ohio Cyber Reserve that can deploy in a matter of hours anywhere in the state and help put systems back online. So those are the kind of things that I'm thinking about that we need to do. But again, it all comes down to we need to be responsible about how we talk about this. The memes and the false narratives that you hear on social media are very dangerous, and people need to be more thoughtful consumers of information and not believe everything they see on a screen.
How about lines at the polls? Somebody referred to your comment about long lines in 2004. I can remember in 2000 seeing polling places in Cleveland. We went out to check. There were lines way out the door at 7:30. At other times, you'd hear other places in the county, no lines at all. How unequal is the process throughout Ohio? Is this isolated incidents that we're getting long lines in some places, not others in Cuyahoga County, or has it improved over the years? Those 2000, 2004 elections seem to be the hot button on that type of thing,
Sure.
too.
So I think, when you look at the election day lines, it can be sort of sporadic. We can look at the voting machine allocations. A lot of times what happens is that in precincts where there are large numbers of people who move frequently, they just haven't updated their address, and so that causes people to have to vote provisionally, and that can slow things down. And so that's one of the reasons why it's been really great to have that option of having the early voting, so that we can sort of shift some of those allocate the resources to election day, to early voting, so that way we can sort of slim down the lines a little bit.
Yeah, I will say, Ohio is amazing in the amount of early voting it has compared to other states, including my now home state of New York, where we just passed early voting this year. Up until this year, the last election, New York did not have early voting. It did not have no excuse absentee balloting. You had to show up on election day, and needless to say, there were long lines, and it was really problematic. And so, early voting and making and it can be a big signal both of problems. I mean, we talked about election security, right? One of the things that helps you spot that is like you have early voting. You can see like, oh, well, there seems to be something anomalous here. Like they're the ballots aren't coming in evenly, or and things like that. And so early voting can be a great signal of things like that. And so Ohio should be commended for having that. It can go a step further and do things like same-day registration that would help ease some of the problems that still exist. And last but not least, it could have voting centers on Election Day, so you don't have to necessarily vote in your precinct, as some states have gone to. So it'll be like early voting. You can go to any one of 25 or 30 places in your county and vote. So.
Is that prevented from the law from doing that in Ohio, or is that something you could do?
That would have to be, to have voting centers on Election Day would have to be a change in law, I believe. But one of the things that we also, and I, for the life of me, no one has been able to explain why this is the case, we don't allow people to return their absentee ballot to their polling location. You have a sworn elections official from each party there. Why can't they accept the absentee ballot at the polling place on Election Day that people want to bring back? The reason why Ohio initially went to early voting was to reduce lines, or it was convenient too, but the real stated purpose was to reduce lines. And our 28 days of early voting do make us a leader in the nation. Many states, they've struggled to pass, 1 week or 2 weeks of early voting. We have 28 days of early voting, including in-person or by mail, no-fault absentee voting in Ohio. And that's something we are and should be proud of. And that includes ample opportunities for weekend voting. I think that we've got, there's some great things that have sort of evolved culturally in the state of Ohio during this decade or so that we've had early voting, a decade and a half that we've had early voting, and things like Souls to the Polls is a great thing. My wife and I participated in one of those when we voted this past November, came and voted on Sunday at the Summit County Board of Elections, and so that's a great thing, and it's been particularly appreciated in the communities of color, but I think that we should work to get more people participating in it from all walks of life. And so weekend voting is a good thing in Ohio, and we'll continue that if I have anything to say about it. And just one of the benefits is that it helps to reduce the lines on Election Day.
So that's something not in law. That's something at the Secretary of State's discretion?
Currently, it should be in law. It shouldn't be up to me. It really shouldn't. The days and hours for early voting shouldn't be left to the discretion of the person that sits in the Secretary of State's chair. That's something that we all know, that Election Day is the first Tuesday after the second Monday in November, right? I mean, it's part of our culture. Those days and hours for early voting should be set out in law. We should be able to agree on it in a bipartisan way, and it be consistent so that people don't have to go to the website and say, now, how late's the Board of Elections open tonight? We should just become accustomed to it because it's predictable and written in law. But
what are we up, about a third or so are voting early, roughly?
Sorry?
About a third of people are voting early?
Yeah, it varies.
And it seems like it goes up a little bit each time.
Goes up a little bit
I don't
each
think
time.
that people running the campaigns have caught up to that, judging by what comes in my mailbox the last day or two before the election.
I always remind candidates that are friends of mine that to build your strategy based on Election Day is flawed.
Well, that's what I was
your
gonna
strategy should be built on Election month that culminates in Election Day. And the trick that now sophisticated campaigns will remove names from their mailing universes and phone calling universes based on who's done early voting. And so if you don't want to be called, and if you don't want to have like a whole ream of paper shoved into your mailbox, then early voting is a great way to get your name scrubbed from those contact lists. So
in those states that are doing all mail-in votes,
Yeah.
has that changed the campaigning patterns? Or are the candidates catching up to that?
Yeah, it has.
Sure, it has.
I mean, obviously, like you're, you begin a lot earlier, right? I mean, in many places you can begin like up to like 40 days beforehand, right? And so you have an aggressive campaign, and you watch who's returned ballots, and you go after and you call people, and you basically do a lot of ballot chasing of your base, right? And that's a lot of, so you're basically doing GOTV the whole time, and so it has so.
How about, is Ohio part of any interstate system on checking make sure that people aren't voting at their winter home in Florida and up here, or moving?
Yeah, but it's limited in effectiveness. We're part of a system called ERIC. There's a outmoded, defunct system that had not been well run called Crosscheck as well, that's not effective anymore. But Crosscheck, or ERIC rather, works well. ERIC was sort of inspired by the Pew Charitable Trust. It has been thoroughly bipartisan in the way that it's been operating. 26 states are now part of it. As I said, my friend, the Michigan Secretary of State, recently entered Michigan into the ERIC program. That's Electronic Registration Information Center, I believe is what the acronym means. But there's only 26 states that are part of it. So if somebody moves to one of those 26 states, then Ohio can be notified. And the problem that we're solving here is that the average person, they may fill out their change of address form, they may, change their utilities and whatever else, but they don't cancel their old registration when they move someplace new, right? And so most people just don't think of that. And so they're leaving behind orphan registrations, as I call them. And my cousin had this happen to her. She lives down in Cincinnati, and she and her husband have owned a home for years. When the Ohio Secretary of State last fall sent out the absentee ballot requests, the forms to request an absentee ballot, they go out to every registered voter that's in the system. She got one, and her husband got one, and the person she bought the house from 6 years ago also got one. And she freaked out and called me and was worried that this person was trying to commit identity theft or voter fraud using her address. Now, it wasn't that. This person moved down in Cincinnati, may have moved to Kentucky or somewhere else, and just never canceled the old registration. So it was just kind of knocking around in the database there, and that's why that happens. So.
Yeah, and people don't. I mean, we should be clear. The premise of people aren't actually voting at their summer house and in Ohio, right? I mean, that just doesn't occur. But people do fill out the census form twice a lot. Sometimes because the wife will fill it out at the house, and then the husband will fill it out at the weekend house. Which is why in the census, white people are always overcounted. There are always actually more white people. People of color are undercounted to the census, and white people are overcounted because white people like filling out forms. And if they get a form at their second house, they will fill it out. So, but people aren't voting twice. Let's be clear on that.
Like their son or daughter at school is supposed to fill it out there, and not mom and dad at home. But.
That's right. So sometimes a child will fill it out in college. I mean, White people don't distrust the government.
Anecdotally, you hear these rare instances where somebody will say, well, I pay property taxes at two places, I should get to, but obviously that's not legal, and we need to make sure that people know that.
I had a question from somebody who wants to know why people who get abatement should be allowed to vote on a property tax, but that's...
Is this a rhetorical question?
I'm just saying.
Why people that get a property tax abatement, why do they get to vote on property taxes? Well, I think that... because it's a question not just for those who pay taxes, but it's a question for the public to decide what's the best tax policy for that jurisdiction. So.
If they disagree, if the questioner disagrees, he or she can run for office and change the law.
There you go. If somebody disagree with you, Michael, I guess they were afraid of you. There's some people in this room that worked hard on issue 1, which is the gerrymandering, and they're asking for you to complement the work on issue 1. So I don't think you'll have a problem with that. But
No, absolutely.
But
issue 1
if I
is...
recall correctly, I heard you at a previous presentation talk about how gerrymandering was really unique to 6 or 7 states because you had to be kind of a purple state, if I'm remembering right, and
Ohio's
have
one
party
of them, yes.
control.
Yeah.
So to complement Ohio, where does this change rank versus those other states that kind of fall in that category where gerrymandering was a big issue?
Ohio has some extreme gerrymandering. Like the states where you have extreme gerrymandering are states that are close to 50-50, right? And like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, where you can slice and dice and recombine voters in a way that gives you an advantage, right? And because if you naturally drew districts, like, if you just sort of plop down shapes, you'd get a good mix of Democrats and Republicans because they live among each other. And you look at a precinct level map or a block level map, and it's not dark red and dark blue. It's like light blue and pink, right? Which indicates if it's pink or light blue, that there are a lot of people of the other party in that block or that precinct. And so you have to really carefully recombine people in order to achieve a 10-3 map in favor of Republicans in North Carolina or a 12-4 map in Ohio, right? Democrats on the congressional vote got about 50% of the congressional vote in Ohio. They have a quarter of the seats. And it's not because the Democrats all live in Cleveland and a handful of places. It really is sort of the breaking up of communities in drawing the maps with politics primarily in mind that allows you to do that.
Well, and this is why I was so adamant from the day I arrived at the legislature in 2010, 2011, January 2011, till I finally got something accomplished, that we needed to finally change the way that district lines are drawn in Ohio. We celebrated the 200th anniversary of the term gerrymandering in 1812. It was started, and in 2012, that would have been 200 years of gerrymandering in honor or dishonor, I suppose, of Elbridge Gerry. But also the way that modern technology has continuously moved forward with GIS and modern polling and data science, it's getting surgical. Like, it's getting worse and worse, the ability for map drawers. And I think that we all believe, as people that care about civic virtue, that politicians shouldn't be picking their voters. Voters should pick their politicians. But the real credit on this, we were able to muster a supermajority vote in the legislature and get this done, and the people of Ohio passed it with 75% support. But the real credit is thousands of volunteers wielding clipboards from the League of Women Voters and many others they held our feet to the fire in the legislature. And I don't know if me, constantly bellyaching about it to my colleagues would have gotten it done. It was the threat of it being put on the ballot and that kind of thing. And so kudos to those groups that stayed at it.
So despite the applause, I have 4 or 5 people that have asked me, so I'll give you one more strike at this, see if you can convince them. The general gist being, like this person's question, isn't it more important, if the court case would go through and be declared unconstitutional, what was done before, isn't it more important to have a vote count in 2020 than to preserve an unconstitutional map in 2020? Why wait 2 years, I guess is what they're saying. And you answered it before, but you didn't convince them, so
Yeah.
I'll give you another chance.
I think that there's a concern of sort of the courts engaging, and this has been the hesitancy. And again, I don't want to sort of get into the wonky separation of powers kind of debate, but the Supreme Court in particular has been really hesitant to weigh in on what many justices have considered sort of an inherently political process. The process for drawing district lines in Ohio was flawed. Flawed processes result in flawed results, but it was the process in place, legally carried out, and already tried and upheld once in the courts. Thank God that process will not play itself out again in 2021, the next time we draw district lines. But this sort of rush to the court idea that we're gonna get it done 2 years earlier is just concerning for sort of the stability of our process. And I think that roughly half of Ohio would find that dissatisfying when we all just came together in record numbers to create a new process, and it would sort of stoke the fires of division again.
But ultimately, that, of course, is up to the courts, and we don't know what the courts will do, and the Supreme Court will get a say in this. And, we often say that this is there are 9 people who really matter in this debate, and maybe 2 on the Supreme Court. But I will make a pitch. Like, if the courts do say that Ohio has to redraw the map, this will be an opportunity for the government of Ohio to conduct the process of redrawing the maps in a very open and transparent way, adopting written criteria that focus on communities and all of the good things that Ohio voters have said that they really care about, having public hearings, allowing the public to submit maps that are then considered by the court. So in other words, it could be a preview of what will happen in Ohio in 2021 if the court comes to say that Ohio has to redraw its legislative maps or its congressional maps. It's an opportunity to begin practicing some of the good practices that will ensure fairer maps going forward.
And also remember, we'd be drawing these maps with 10-year-old data. So that would be the part of the challenge, is that we'd be using the census data from 2010 to redraw 2019 maps potentially.
Well, you'll have experts, though.
Yeah.
We could adjust that.
So it's been a great discussion tonight. One person forgot to thank at the beginning is Michael Barron in the back, is really the person that set this whole thing up. And I appreciate I appreciate all the questions. Make my life easy in some way and hard in others, because if I'd gotten to everybody's question, we'd be here until tomorrow morning. So to close things up, to try to get us out of here close to 8:30, why don't I give you each an opportunity for what you think is most important that people should think about, remember, ponder, talk to their neighbors about, whatever, on voting rights going forward.
Well, I mean, I want to thank you all for coming and doing the important work of getting yourselves up to speed and getting updates on what we're doing here in Ohio. I think you just got to go home and talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, make sure that you're inviting them to participate, make sure they're voting, make sure they get all the updates about how they can get involved, how they can continue to push for these reforms, because I think we have a really exciting opportunity to continue to build on the success that we have here in Ohio. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of those great reforms with automatic voter registration hopefully rolling out, getting those absentee applications, the postage paid. I think there are a lot of really good things. The early voting hours, of course, getting those set. So I think we're in a good place.
I will just end by with what I began with, which is that you guys have won the battle. You haven't yet won the war on some of these issues, and so there's a lot of work to be done to be a watchdog on this process. It will be more transparent. It will be fairer than it's ever been, but there's still a lot of room for slippage between the cup and the lip. If people aren't out there organizing and mobilizing and analyzing and pushing for what they want out of the process that will take place in 2021 in redistricting. So.
We live in a time where there is I won't say unprecedented, because we know that there's a long history. As long as there's been government, there has been some level of high anxiety and incivility and that kind of thing. Heck, I saw Hamilton last night in Columbus, and let's remember that we had a Secretary of the Treasury and a Vice President shoot one another. So things have been bad before. Shoot at one another. One of them failed to hit his target, but anyway. It's been bad before, right? Incivility is nothing new, but we have a lot of polarization, and we have a lot of incivility, and we have a lot of people that are concerned about that, me included. But let's not do the Chicken Little sort of sky is falling thing, because I'm an optimist. We live in a time when it's kind of, in many ways, I see a possible sort of golden age of civic engagement. Let's look at the bright side of this. People get emotional about politics and public policy because it matters, right? Let's work on helping our fellow Ohioans channel that high emotion into a more productive route than maybe just sort of sharing memes on social media. Let's help people get engaged and support candidates they believe in, and it's easier now than it's ever been in our history to engage in that process and to be a voter. And I think that, and this again, willfully romantic, I recognize, but that each generation of Americans has a big challenge, a big problem to solve. Whether it's the founding generation that overcame the world's most powerful army to create this nation, though imperfect at the time, or whether it's the generation that brought about the civil rights movement, or won the 2 world wars, or put people on the moon. Each generation of Americans has a problem to solve, I think. And I'm starting to think that our generation's big problem to solve is to make self-government work again. And I look forward to embracing that challenge with each and every one of you, because it's too important not to. And so thank you for your interest in this. I look forward to working with all of you.
Just got an image of a Steve Mnuchin, Mike Pence duel, so that was...
Well, thanks to our panel, and thanks to the sponsors, and thank you for coming, because it'd be fun, that empty room.